everybody, and welcome to part 15 of our Lives of the Apostles series, where we're walking through the lives of the 12 apostles in 3 different ways. First, we're talking about their fictional storylines from the TV show The Chosen. Then we're talking about what we know about their lives from the text of Scripture. And then thirdly, we're concluding these videos by talking about what we might or might not know about their lives from the traditions that developed in the early years of the early church. My name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest, and today we're talking about our 11th apostle, Simon the Zealot. So far, we have talked about Simon Peter, his brother Andrew, James son of Zebedee, his brother John. We've talked about Philip, we've talked about Nathaniel, we've talked about Matthew, we have talked about Thomas, we've talked about James son of Alphaeus, and we have talked about Thaddeus, and that brings us to Simon the Zealot, which will be our second to last apostle right before Judas Iscariot. And that being said, I'm going to pray for us, and then we're just going to hop right in by talking about Simon the Zealot according to The Chosen. Real quick, I do want to announce this though, because I just realized that I'm wearing this for the first time. This is a shirt with my logo on it, right? We have the Now Let's Be Honest merch available now, so be sure to go check out the link in my description if you want to get a shirt like this. I actually really like this logo, and I like the style of shirt, and so be sure if you want to support us, go buy it. You don't have to. That's fine. But I thought I'd let you know that we do have merch available now, so be sure to go to the link go follow the link in the description down below, and be sure to buy one of these shirts if you want to support us in a way in addition to just watching these videos. But since you're watching these videos, also be sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with all your friends so that we can get people talking about this stuff. But that being said, I've rambled on long enough. Let's start with a word of prayer. Lord, we love you. We thank you for another day to live and breathe. And I pray that even before we go into this study, God, that we will just take a moment to reflect on the God who gave us this day. We sometimes take that stuff for granted, God. We take every breath for granted, but every breath that we have is a gift of your grace. And so we thank you, God, for the ability to be alive, for the ability to see, to hear, to experience all these things, to learn about you, God. That is the greatest gift of all. The ability to know you, to be known by you, God. We thank you for that. And as we go about this study, I pray that this will not be purely an intellectual pursuit, but that we will learn about these apostles and these men that you appointed so that we might learn from them and we might go out into the world to proclaim your name just as they did. We love you, God. We thank you for these men that you appointed, and we pray that through studying them, our passion and our desire for you will grow all the more, and our desire to live for you and even die for you will also be increased. We love you, God. We thank you for everything you have done, you are doing, and you will do. And we pray that you will make us part of the solution that this world so desperately needs. And it's in your name, your beautiful name, that we pray. Amen. All right, let's get started by talking about Simon the Zealot according to The Chosen. We actually know more about Simon the Zealot's life than any of the other apostles, because we meet him at the moment of his birth as his crippled brother Jesse watches from the other room. His mother dies in childbirth, leaving Jesse to fill in her role as the primary caretaker while their father ensures their provision. Their father eventually remarries, and as Simon grows older, he makes an intentional effort to include his brother in his and his friends' activities. As the years pass, the brothers form an extremely close bond, but everything changes one day when Simon and Jesse witness a Roman soldier beating a Jewish man. Simon, enraged by this, begins associating himself with the wrong crowd, leading to an estranged relationship between himself and his brother. Eventually, Simon decides to leave the family, leaving nothing behind except a letter for his brother announcing his sudden departure. He goes off to join the Zealots, where he is trained to be an expert fighter and a trained assassin. Decades pass with Simon so focused on his training that he never bothers to check in on his brother. After a successful training exercise where Simon demonstrates his prowess at deception and stealth, the Zealots choose him as the leading operator in the assassination of a Roman magistrate, Rufus, who is coming to Jerusalem in the next few days. Simon willingly and joyfully accepts this appointment and makes his way to Jerusalem. However, as soon as he arrives, his questionable alibi to the Romans at the Jerusalem gates raises the suspicions of Atticus, a Roman investigator sent to spy out situations such as this. Simon navigates his way to the secret tunnels of Jerusalem, but Atticus is close on his trail, watching his every move. He and his crew make plans to attack Rufus the following Sabbath, and they begin to go about the necessary preparations. The morning of the assassination, Simon is listening to a man read from the scriptures whenever the man begins to read about the promise that, when Messiah comes, the lame and the oppressed will be delivered from their afflictions. This seems to get his mind thinking, and as he overlooks the city, looking at the crucified victims who represent the fate he might face if his plan doesn't go perfectly, he seems to realize that he wants to visit his brother one more time, just in case things go awry. He locates Simon at the Pool of Bethesda, and while the reunion is joyful at first, it quickly devolves into a dispute concerning their diverging philosophies of life. Jesse is critical of Simon's zeal and willingness to commit acts of violence, while Simon is critical of Jesse's hopelessness, superstitious attitude, and lack of faith in God. Nevertheless, it's evident that the two still care for each other, and since Simon knew he might very well be dead before the night is up, he wanted the opportunity to say goodbye the right way. As he departs, Jesse begins to read from the note Simon had left him decades earlier. In it, Simon quoted the very passage he had heard being read in the temple earlier that morning, and he had told Jesse that if the day ever came when his brother walked on 2 feet, he would know that the Messiah had come. Until then, he would fight for their people, paving the way for the Messiah's arrival. Simon says that he still holds to such a belief, and he departs, immediately beginning his final preparations for the coming assassination. When the time finally arrives, everything is going according to plan. Unbeknownst to Simon, Atticus has caught on to their plan and has devised a scheme of his own. But Simon never comes to learn this, for just as he is about to jump the Roman official, who is secretly Atticus in disguise, he sees Jesse walking by. Yes, walking by. Abandoning everything, a confused Simon approaches his brother, who delightfully begins to dance on his own 2 feet. Simon doesn't know what's happened, but he knows one thing for certain. The Messiah has arrived. When we encounter Simon again, he is camping outside the city performing his early morning routines. Whenever a demon-possessed man wanders nearby him, Simon approaches cautiously. But when the man asks Simon to kill him, Simon denies the request, saying it is better for the demon to remain in him than for it to depart and enter into another, weaker person. When the man tells him that the demon has a bad feeling about him, Simon says thank you. A little while later, a commotion breaks out whenever the demon-possessed man begins harassing some women in a camp nearby. Simon jumps in to intervene, but whenever he turns to check on the group, the demoniac overpowers him and begins to strangle him. At the last possible moment, a man comes running into the camp, calling for the demon to come out of the demoniac. As Simon watches in disbelief, a creepy man named John helps him to his feet, but he can't turn his eyes from the man who has saved him. When he asks, the man affirms that he is indeed the one who healed Jesse. And when Simon asks him if he's the Messiah, the man affirms that he is. Simon asks him where his army is, and the man directs Simon's attention to everyone gathered around him, a group of misfits who are certainly in no condition to lead a war against Rome. The two go for a walk where the man, Jesus, reveals that he has healed Jesse in order to get Simon's attention. Simon vows his allegiance to Jesus, and when Jesus asks to see his sick dagger, Simon is surprised that Jesus casts it away into the lake, saying that he doesn't need Simon's fighting skills. In fact, he has everything he needs already. He merely wanted Simon. When the group eventually returns to Galilee, they are confronted by a ginormous shock whenever Roman soldiers come to apprehend Jesus. Though Jesus vows to be back soon, Simon interprets his words as a cryptic message that they should go and break Jesus out of custody. They should be the ones who help him return soon, earning him the sharp rebuke of another disciple named Nathanael. Later that night, as he is keeping watch, Simon perceives Jesus praying in the distance, having returned just as he said. Jesus rebukes them for doubting him, and when one of the other disciples asks that Jesus teach them how to pray, the rest of them stand and listen as Jesus complies with the request. In the days that follow, the group is busy preparing for a big sermon Jesus is preparing to preach to the people of Galilee, leaving many of the disciples on edge. When Simon returns from his morning run, one of the disciples, John, begins to lash out at him about his vigorous exercise routine, arguing that it stinks of Hellenism. As they discuss plans for the sermon, Simon argues that they need to make sure that they keep their eye out in the event someone tries to harm Jesus. Disputes continue to break out in the days leading up to the event, but everything works out in the end, and Simon stands with the rest of the group as Jesus smiles at them, mounts the steps, and walks onto the stage, prepared to deliver his Sermon on the Mount. Okay, well, now that we've talked about Simon the Zealot according to the Chosen, it's time to turn our attention to Simon the Zealot according to the text of Scripture. Simon the Zealot according to the Bible. This is my favorite section of all these videos, and so this is the one I'm always very, very excited to go about. And kind of like with some of the other apostles, before we actually get to Simon's biographical information, I wanted to address something right off the bat. This is something that I probably could have reserved for later in the video, but to me it's probably one of the most important and the most rewarding studies and all of this stuff about Simon the Zealot. And so I just wanted to start off with this because I think it's very important, and especially given how he's portrayed in The Chosen, I thought this would be a very valuable thing to address right off the bat, and that is the question whether or not Simon the Zealot was a zealot, or is he merely zealous? And this is what I mean by that. There's debate over whether or not Simon the Zealot belonged to the political group called the Zealots, or whether that nickname was merely describing an attribute of him, or specifically that he was zealous for the law of God. And so we want to answer this question right off the bat, and then after we talk about this for a while, we're going to spend some time on this, just kind of working through this. After that, then we can actually start talking about Simon the Zealot according to what we know about him in the Bible. But first, I want to work through some of the traditions and stuff like that in regards to who the Zealots were and whether or not Simon was one of those guys. And so the first thing that we need to talk about whenever we're approaching this whole issue is the four philosophies of Jewish thought at this time period, because the Zealots were known as the fourth philosophy. And so let's just talk about the four main political groups that we see at this time period in the first century. And what you need to know about this, I think sometimes whenever people go about this discussion, they might not necessarily have the correct view of these four different philosophies, but I think philosophy is actually a very proper term here, because what we're going to see here is that these aren't just, they're not the same as denominations as we have them nowadays in religious circles. You know, we have like Baptists, Pentecostals, Lutherans, all that stuff, but it's also not the same as a political party, right? Like a political party, we have liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats. It's not the same as that either. Instead, what we're going to encounter with these four different philosophies are different ways of thinking. That's why I think philosophy is a very good term to use here, because really it's almost a blending of a political party and a religious denomination. And that's because, given the structure of the Jewish culture, those two things were very intertwined and intermixed. Over in America, I don't know where you're watching this from, but in America, we have this whole thing, you know, we have the Establishment Clause, the Freedom of Religion Clause, to where you can't enforce anybody to follow a certain religion, and therefore there is this separation of church and state. In Judaism, according to the law, that separation does not exist, because Judaism existed as a theocracy, and therefore the political parties and the religious denominations were very intertwined, and it was basically based off of your worldview and how you applied the Bible in your present life. And so these four philosophies, I think that's a very appropriate term to use whenever we're talking about these, because it is a mixture of a political party, religious denomination, because religion and politics were very closely intertwined, as they are nowadays. Even in America, those things are going to influence one another, but especially in a theocracy and in a theocratic setting, that's even more important, because they literally have to define one another, because you're making your judgments based off of the law that comes from God. And so the first group we want to talk about is a group called the Sadducees. These people, we can also call them the compromisers. And what you need to know about the Sadducees is that these were mainly aristocrats and priests. Oftentimes, they were aristocratic priests who maintained religious power by compromising their values and working alongside Rome. So these people were the ones who were largely the ones in charge of the Jewish system at this time period. A lot of the high priests, they would have been Sadducees. A lot of the priests in general would have been Sadducees. And the reason why they were aristocratic is because a lot of the times they would compromise their beliefs in order to gain power from Rome. And as a result, they would be on the wealthier side of things. So whenever we encounter the Sadducees in the Bible, we have to realize that they were not the majority group, but they were very, very influential at that time period, because they had the religious authority on their sides, because they kind of partnered with Rome. What we know about these people is that they did not believe in a resurrection or an afterlife, and that this becomes very important in the text of Scripture with certain questions that they raise against Jesus, and they only followed the Torah. In this way, they were actually very similar to the Samaritans, because the Samaritan people at this time period, they only followed the first 5 books of the Bible, which we know as the Pentateuch, what Jews would call the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. This is also called the law, the books of Moses. The Sadducees only really adhered to these as rules for living, in a similar way that the Samaritans did as well. And this is going to shape a lot of how they view things, because that means that you're taking everything from Judges to the end of the Old Testament, and they're just kind of disregarding that, and they're not putting as heavy an emphasis on it. They might treat those books how we treat like other history textbooks, or even non-canonical texts that came from the time of the Bible, right? They might still read them, but they didn't view them as authoritative scripture, and so that dictated a lot of how they lived. In addition to this, they didn't believe in fate, and they thought that God was largely unconcerned with the smaller details of human actions. So in many ways, the Sadducees could be compared to perhaps the deists of the I guess there's still deists around nowadays, but you saw this especially during the 1700s and 1800s, especially in America. Basically, like the watchmaker god, the one who gets things running but doesn't really care about what you do after that. That's kind of how the Sadducees viewed God. And I do want to clarify as we're going into this discussion, I'm not going to be going into a lot of detail about these guys. Eventually, I'd actually like to do videos on every single one of these groups and just really flesh out what they believed. So this is going to be a very broad view of these things. I'm painting with a very broad brush. And so in a way, these might be caricatures of these people where there are more nuances and stuff, but I'm just kind of giving you the main points that kind of separated these groups. So I just want to say that right off the bat. But these guys, they kind of viewed God as very distant and unconcerned with the smaller details of human actions. And so, he wanted you to serve him, but he really didn't care about the tiny little details that we often get ourselves concerned with. And so we could probably summarize their philosophy as in the world and of it. Not only were they living in the world amongst other sinful human beings, but they also were very fine with compromising their beliefs in order to kind of adapt themselves to the culture around them. This leads us to the second group, which we would call the Pharisees. And these groups, these people, we can call them the separatists. So the Sadducees, they're the compromisers, and the Pharisees, they are the separatists. What we can say about the Pharisees is that this was the most popular group, and it's largely the origin of modern rabbinic Judaism to this day. So in AD 70, in the 70th year, Anno Domini, right, in the year of our Lord. So in AD 70, the Romans would come in and they would destroy the temple. Since the Sadducees were the priestly class, with no temple, that means there are really no Sadducees. And the Pharisees are the ones who kind of became the dominant voice in Judaism because the Sadducees' power was crucially linked to the temple. And so, as a result of this, the Pharisees end up becoming the linchpin and the foundation for what we now know as rabbinic Judaism. And so if you go over to Israel nowadays and you interact with a bunch of Orthodox Jews, their influence is going to primarily be from the Pharisees. And therefore, a lot of what you see in Pharisaic Judaism at the time of Jesus is going to still apply nowadays in modern Orthodox Judaism because they really are the foundation of that belief system. While the Sadducees maintained religious authority, the Pharisees' popularity with the masses kept them in check. And so this is the big difference here, right? We see the Pharisees and Sadducees both being very prominent in the Gospels. And the main reason is because the Sadducees held the religious authority, but the Pharisees kind of held the political authority when it came to having the popular vote, right? The Sadducees, they were the ones who were actually in charge of the temple and stuff, but the Pharisees were the ones who... they weren't necessarily aristocratic. They were more the blue-collared guys who all the people could get behind, right? They were the average Joes who really studied the law a whole lot and had a very strict view of the law, but everybody got behind them, and these people, they weren't compromising, and so they actually stood for something, and so people seemed to respect that, and they really got behind the Pharisees. And so this was the largest group of the four different philosophies, and people really seemed to like them a whole lot more than the Sadducees, who were, nobody really cares for people who compromise because the Sadducees were mainly seeking selfish gain, whereas the Pharisees did seem to have a lot of things right. And I think that's something that we make a mistake of whenever we look at the Pharisees nowadays, and we mainly look down upon them and we think that they're terrible. When in reality, if you look at the teachings of Jesus, he was closest to being a Pharisee. And I think that's actually why he spends so much time rebuking them. Because if somebody is totally off kilter, you don't have to spend much time rebuking them because everybody knows they're wrong. Jesus spent so much time rebuking the Pharisees because they were so close to the truth and they were just barely off of it, and they'd actually made it self-righteous and self-serving. And so Jesus had a lot to say to condemn them, but they were so close to the truth. And we even read about saved Pharisees whenever you get to the book of Acts. In addition to just the general idea of Pharisees, these are some of the things that are more particular about their beliefs. In contrast to the Sadducees, who didn't believe in a resurrection and an afterlife, these guys did believe in a resurrection and an afterlife, and they also believed that virtuous behavior commended them to people and that the law needed to be followed with utmost precision. As a result of this, they actually developed this oral tradition, this oral law that you'll hear about a lot in the New Testament. And this oral law was basically their way of building a hedge around the law to make sure that they were not sinning against God. The issue is that they started enforcing this law upon other people, right? So it started off with good intentions, right? God says, don't get within 1 foot of this person. They say, well, you know what? To be safe, I'm not going to get within 6 feet. That's really good. The issue is whenever you start enforcing that law upon other people. You're wanting to honor God, but if you're enforcing that on other people, you're now teaching the traditions of men as if they were the commandments of God, and God really does not like that. And so that's the main fault with the Pharisees, and that's what Jesus is going to get onto them about a whole lot. And so this philosophy, we can summarize them as in the world, not of it. And you'll notice that I chose those words very carefully because the Pharisees, like I said, are the closest to the Christian movement nowadays. These people, they realized you have to live in the world amongst sinful human beings, amongst people who don't worship God, but you have to realize that you're separate from them and you have to maintain this righteousness, this holiness, this set-apartedness. They understood that, they just didn't apply it in the correct way. Whereas the Sadducees, they were in the world and of it, right? They were interacting with sinners and they were becoming like them. They were just compromising their beliefs. The Pharisees were trying to hold that tension, which actually sets them in contrast to the next group we have to talk about. These are the Essenes. These people aren't actually mentioned in the Bible, but we do have hints of their influence throughout there, and some people even suggest that John the Baptist might have been an Essene. I don't really know whether or not that's the case, but the Essenes were a very prominent group during this time period that you have to mention if you want to understand the Jewish mindset at the time of Christ. The Essenes are the people that we can call the monks, and the reason why we call them monks is because they were a monastic group who basically retreated from the greater Jewish community in order to live a monastic life where they could devote themselves more fully to God and the following of his law. So these people, they had a totally different response than the Pharisees, right? Basically what we see is we see these people growing in their, in the order that we list in these philosophies, they're growing in their desire to obey God. The Sadducees, they really didn't care that much. They were willing to compromise their beliefs as long as they could have political gain, religious gain, more influence, right? The Pharisees, they really wanted to serve God, and so they had a very strict observance of the law, but they stayed within the general public so that they could live as holy even amongst the people who were not being holy. The Essenes, though, they also wanted to live for God, and so that's very righteous, but what they did is that they extracted themselves from the communities around them in order that they could devote themselves more fully to God. That sounds really good, other than the fact that you have to realize that God's goal for us is to bring other people into that community. How can you do that if you're separate from everybody else? And so that's really the downfall of monasticism, because these guys, yes, they're getting apart and they're living for God, but the thing is, it's almost a very selfish way of doing it because you're focusing on your own personal holiness, but you're not actually inviting anybody else to do that as well. And so that's really the downfall of the Essenes here. These are some more specific things about what they believed. They held all things in common, they practiced hospitality, and they held that all things ultimately belong to God. This is very similar to what we see in the years of the early church whenever you get to Acts chapters 2, 3, and 4, all that stuff. A lot of the early Christians, how they acted is they actually held all things in common. If your brother had no coat and you had two, you would give him one of your coats. Because nowadays in churches, we act more like businesses. The early church was designed to act more like a family, to function like a family, to where we treated one another with the type of respect where, okay, if my brother is in need, I will provide for them. It's not a matter of I'm giving 10% or 20% or 30% to the church. Rather, it's saying I'm giving as much as I can to make sure that everybody in our community has everything they need to live faithfully and serve God as best they possibly can. That's how that mentality was in the early church, and the Essenes did seem to at least understand that, and they held all things in common. And so whenever they retreated away into this monastic life, everything they did was for the betterment of the community. And I think that's really beautiful, and I think that's something that we as a church need to learn to adapt nowadays. It was not an individualistic mindset, it was a community-based mindset where we're trying to provide for one another and love each other for the glory of God. The Essenes did get that very, very well, but they also had some other extreme views that I would say are not as good. They did believe in both a resurrection and an afterlife. We're going to see that with the last three groups. That's true with all of them. They all believed in a resurrection and an afterlife. It's only the Sadducees who did not. But these guys did not marry. They lived celibate lives because, once again, they were wanting to dedicate themselves entirely to God. And so they didn't marry. All of them were celibate. And that's why this group was very short-lived, because if you're retreating away from everybody and you're not marrying, well, that means you're also not repopulating. And so you're not spreading the movement, and you can see how this would die off very, very quickly. But it does seem like the Essenes are the ones who are responsible for giving us the Dead Sea Scrolls and stuff, because a lot of people would say that the Qumran community and the communities around the Dead Sea area, those were actually Essenes, and so these people had a very rich written history and written records of their traditions and things that they held to. But much like the Pharisees, they did build upon the law, but it was in a different way. Because the Pharisees were applying their oral law to everybody, whereas the Essenes were specifically applying their law to the community that they had developed, which that's not as bad, because if these people are retreating into this community, they are collectively agreeing to follow the community standards. And so in that way, it wasn't necessarily as legalistic, it was more an accountability group, right? We're going to set ourselves apart and we're going to hold these views, right? And so, and sadly, amongst those is that they couldn't marry. But to their credit, they also did not have any servants. And so they were actually very progressive in their understanding of the fact that maybe slavery is not something that God necessarily approved of. And they actually did all their work themselves. They did their work for one another. And so that's actually a really cool thing about the Essenes. And therefore, when it comes to summarizing their philosophy, we can say that they were neither in the world nor of it, right? So that's really their downfall. Because the Sadducees, they were in the world and of it. That's one extreme. The Pharisees were holding that tension. And then the Essenes, they went to the other extreme from the Pharisees. The Pharisees were just compromising in everything. The Essenes were unwilling to compromise. And so they were actually trying to protect themselves by retreating from the world and retreating from ungodly people in order that they could live for God. But as a result, that means that they were sacrificing that godly influence they could have on people. The Pharisees did seem to understand you have to live amongst people, and that temptation towards sinfulness is always going to exist. And so you can see where the Pharisees developed this oral tradition that would develop from them, because they were trying to protect themselves from the temptations of living in an ungodly world. And I think that's always something that's going to occur whenever people are trying to be faithful to God, living in a sinful world. And so we might be quick to condemn the Pharisees, but I think we should actually learn from them, and we should learn from their mistakes so we don't do the same thing, but we should also admire them for the good things that they did do. The Essenes, however, we have just two different extremes, right? We have the people who are just willing to compromise all their beliefs, the people who are so unwilling to compromise that they actually retreat in order to try to prevent themselves from being tempted. God isn't saying we need to avoid temptation. We just need to learn how to endure temptation, and we need to learn how to live in an ungodly world and be faithful to Him. That is the tension that the believer is called to hold at all times. It's not easy, but that's why we have to rely on Him. And those are the three main philosophies of the Jewish belief system at that time period. And this leads us to the fourth philosophy, which is going to be our main focus in our discussion today. And that group is the Zealots. And these are the guys that we can call the rebels. And I know you're probably thinking of Star Wars right now, but that's not what we're talking about. But there are some similarities between them and the rebels in Star Wars, because these people were vastly opposed to the domineering empire that was trying to change their way of life. I'm going to summarize this a lot quicker, because in the next slide we're going to spend a lot more time detailing who the Zealots were. But just for the short rub of it, this was a violent group of people who were opposing Roman rule. At the time period that we encountered Jesus and his disciples and the gospel narratives, the Romans had taken over basically the entire known world, and they were very oppressive in their reign in a lot of places. I mean, some people didn't mind the Roman rule, but for the Jews who were trying to worship God, the Roman influence was a terrible, terrible thing, and it really prevented you from fully obeying God's law. Some people, and really all these different philosophies are ways of people trying to figure out, how do we deal with Roman oppression? The Sadducees said, you know what? No use fighting it. Let's use it to our advantage. And that's how they became the aristocrats and the priests. The Pharisees said, you know what? We're going to try our best to endure it, and we're going to try to live faithfully amidst it. That's probably a healthier mentality. The Essenes said, you know what? We're just going to retreat away where we can just have our own communities. And so they actually just abandoned the Roman rule, and they're like, we're just fleeing to the desert. We're going to do our own thing. So once again, two extremes. The Zealots, however, their response was, it is our responsibility to take out these Roman oppressors. And you can see how they would be influenced by this because of a lot of the stuff you read about in the Old Testament, where God is actually instructing his people to wipe out the pagan influences from around them. And also during the intertestamental time period between the Old and New Testaments, you have a lot of this going on where there's foreign oppressors, pagan oppressors who are coming in, oppressing Israel, and people rise up to defeat them and deliver the people back to God. So you could see how the people called the Zealots would arise, and they would want to rebel against Roman rule in order to restore a reformed Judaism unto God so they could live for the glory of God and usher in the Messianic reign. You could see how these people would develop, but I don't think it's necessarily what God wanted, and we're going to see that in this discussion. These people did believe in the resurrection and the afterlife, and that's because really what the Zealots were is that they were a radical view of Pharisaic beliefs. They basically took all the things that the Pharisees believed and they took them to the extreme. So they were living amongst the people, but rather than not only being of them, rather than being not of them, they were actually actively opposed to them. And so their philosophy we can describe as in the world and against it. So the Pharisees, their solution was, we're going to live amongst the pagan people, we're going to live amongst the sinful people, but we're going to maintain that separation where we understand we are not of these people. We belong to God, not to man. The Pharisees understood that. The Zealots took that to a greater extreme. They said, we are going to live amongst this pagan people, but rather than not only not identifying with them, we actually are going to actively oppose them to try to kick them out of here so that we can have a holy nation, so that we can be a holy people. And so the Pharisees were wanting to endure the Roman oppression and live faithfully to God. The Zealots took this further and they said, we're going to endure this oppression, but eventually we're going to rebel. And that's what we're going to see with the Zealots. So let's talk a little bit more about them. Who were the Zealots? There's this guy named Josephus. He was a early historian who actually wrote during the first century, so less than 100 years after Christ. Josephus is writing. He was actually a military general for the Jewish people who eventually defected to Rome, and while he was in Rome, he actually wrote all these books detailing the histories of the Jewish people. Really interesting to read, and these come from the same time period that the Bible is being written, which is very, very unique and a very crucial source for us when it comes to understanding what Jews believed at this time period. And this is what he says in his book, Antiquities of the Jews. He actually goes through and he defines all the four main political parties, religious denominations, the four philosophies of the Jewish people at this time period. And whenever he gets to the Zealots, this is what he says. Of the fourth sect of Jewish philosophy, Judas the Galilean was the author. These men agree in all other things with Pharisaic notions, but they have an inviolable attachment to liberty and say that God is to be their only ruler and Lord. They also do not value dying any kinds of death, nor indeed do they heed the deaths of their relations and friends, nor can any such fear make them call any man Lord. And since the immovable resolution of theirs is well known to a great many, I shall speak no further about that matter, nor am I afraid that anything I have said of them should be disbelieved, but rather fear that what I have said is beneath the resolution they show when they undergo pain. And it was in Gessius Florus's time that the nation began to grow with this distemper, who was our procurator, and who occasioned the Jews to go wild with it by the abuse of his authority and to make them revolt from the Romans. And so what Josephus is telling us here is that the Zealots are primarily the reason that the Jewish war broke out a few years later, after the time of Jesus, right? About 30 years later, almost 40 years later, 35-ish, some people led a rebellion against Rome, which ultimately led to the destruction of the temple and basically the destruction of the people of Israel. And the Zealots are the ones who are primarily responsible for that. And there are four main things that he tells us here about what the Zealots believed. First and foremost, they agreed theologically with the Pharisees. So if you go earlier in his book where he describes the Pharisees, you can basically take all of that stuff that the Pharisees believed and you can apply it to the Zealots. We're not going to take our time to break that down now, but if you go look at that, you will see that they agreed with all those same things. Secondly, they were hyper-focused on freedom and liberty. I think for those of you watching this who are Americans, you can understand this because we have that same mentality nowadays. The way we became a nation is because from this thing called the War for Independence. We value freedom above all things, and we live in a democratic nation, right, where we are hyper-focused on freedom and liberty. And I think what we can learn from the Zealots is that isn't necessarily always the best thing, especially if we realize that we have to be slaves to God, right? Because there is this understanding that we won't always be a free people because we have to learn to subject ourselves to the right authorities. But the desire for freedom and liberty isn't always a bad thing either, right? So what we see here in America is some of the same stirrings that eventually led to the Zealot party. And so as an American, I just want to caution us against that. We have to understand that freedom isn't necessarily always a good thing. It depends on who's in charge. No matter what, you're always going to be a slave to something. Who are you a slave to? Are you a slave to your political party, your religious denomination? Are you a slave to your own thoughts, your own worldview? Or are you a slave to God? Are you a slave to freedom? That's another issue, right? You want to be a slave to God. And the Zealots, they were so focused on liberty and freedom that I think that they actually twisted the word of God in order to justify their actions. The third thing that we see about the Zealots is that they viewed God as their only ruler. I think that is actually very admirable of them, but I think they twisted that in order to misunderstand how that applies. Because God does say, you shall have no other gods before me, right? And what he means by that, he's not just speaking about, I want to be first in line. He's saying before me as a king, sitting on a throne, don't have any more gods in my presence. And so God is supposed to be our only ruler. But the Bible also does teach that there is human leadership and human authority that God has put in place to guide us. And so we have to realize that yes, God is our only ruler, but also he is our chiefmost ruler. And with him as our ruler, we should learn how to respond to the people around us. The Zealots were unwilling to admit to any other authority other than God. And therefore, when other authority arises up, their immediate response is rebel, rebel, rebel. What we're going to see is that Paul actually has the opposite view. He says, you know what? If foreign oppressors arise, submit yourselves to them. Submit insofar as you can be obedient to God, and if they try to get you to be disobedient to God, then you should be willing to suffer and die for your faith. But the response is never to rebel in such a way that causes violence or incites violence. Rather, it's to suffer and die. That is our rebellion. Our rebellion is through our persecution, not necessarily through our violence. We don't have to fight for power because God's already in control. And so we're going to see how the Christians have a radically different view of how to handle authority than the Zealots do. And then fourthly, he says that they were willing to die and kill for their beliefs. And this is what really set them apart from all the other groups, because these guys were extremists. They were rebels who were willing to go to the opposite end of extremes in order to put an end to Roman rule. They were willing to kill people. They were willing to do whatever it took in order to put God on the throne, even though God was already enthroned, right? So these guys, they went to that extreme. God wasn't telling them to do that. That's the difference. In the Old Testament, God's explicitly telling people, go do this. He's not telling the Zealots to do that, and they have no reason to think that, but they would use, like we do the same thing nowadays, where we take certain scriptures and we make them about us and we apply them. I think the Zealots did the same thing. They took those, they're like, that applies to me, and I'm going to go do it, but that's not what God instructed. He said certain things to certain people at certain times wasn't meant for them. But they were willing to die and kill for their beliefs. And it says that they had no regard for if their friends died, right? They had like this detachment from the world and from people to where they were willing to sacrifice whatever it was for the sake of their cause. And so that is a bit of an issue. Specifically, it wouldn't be an issue if that's what God commanded. But it is an issue because God did not tell them to do this. And Josephus tells us that Judas the Galilean was the author of this movement. And so let me just talk about who this guy was. Judas of Galilee, or Judas of Gamala, it's presented in both ways. He was a Jewish leader who led a revolt against the Romans in 6 AD whenever Quirinius imposed the census for tax purposes. You'll remember Quirinius because he was also, he's the same guy who imposed a census earlier on whenever Jesus was born, right? So he did this quite a bit. And in one instance, in 6 AD, so Jesus would have been probably around 10 or 11 years old at this time, or maybe a little bit younger than that. He would have maybe been like 7 or 8 or 9. I don't know. We don't know exactly when Jesus was born. But he would have been maybe 8 or 9 at this time period. And at this time period, they sent out another notice that there needed to be another census. And this was particularly for the imposition of taxes, and Judas the Galilean did not like this because he did not like Roman rule. So he told Jews not to register for the census, and if they did, he and his followers would burn down their houses and steal their cattle. And so he actually started oppressing some of the Jewish people because they were buckling down to Rome, right? They were actually submitting to Rome. And he said, if you submit to Rome, I will burn down your house and I'll steal your cattle. And so we can see how this would actually split the Jewish people. But for those people who backed Judas's cause, he would really like this because you see how extreme he was in his desire to live for God. He was willing to punish those Jews who were submitting to pagan oppressors. This is something that would really appeal to somebody from an Old Testament mindset, because this is similar to what God instructed people to do during the times of Joshua, and during the times of the Judges, and during the times of David and Solomon. This is what they were sometimes instructed to do. But Judas was not instructed to do this. Scholars debate over whether or not Judas of Gamala actually founded the Zealot party, or if perhaps he was simply a big inspiration for them, and that's really what we're going to have to wrestle through in our discussion over whether or not Simon the Zealot belonged to this political/religious party. Because Josephus says that Judas the Galilean was the author. However, it doesn't seem like there was an official organized group called the Zealots until the years immediately preceding the Jewish revolt, which broke out in AD 66 and lasted until AD 73. And so whenever we actually look at the historical records, it seems like the Zealot party did not formally exist until just right before that revolt broke out in AD 66. However, Josephus says that Judas the Galilean, 60 years earlier, is the author. And so we have to wrestle through what he means there. Is he saying that he actually was the author in the sense of he was the founder of this party, and therefore it existed from AD 6 all the way till there? If that's the case, that means that we just don't have any other records of it in between. Or it could just be saying that he was the author in the sense of he was their key inspiration. Whenever the Zealots finally did develop in AD 60-ish or something like that, they look back at Judas the Galilean as their inspiration. And this would make sense because we have Judas the Galilean even being referenced in the book of Acts. I believe it's Acts chapter 4 when Gamaliel brings him up as an example of a failed Messiah figure. And so we know that Judas the Galilean was somebody who historically was kind of revered, or at least thought about quite a bit in the Jewish mindset at that time period. We just don't know what specific role he played in regards to the development of the Zealot party. Because if he was the author, that means that this thing existed from AD 6 onwards, because whenever he did all this stuff, he founded that party and it existed until their ultimate collapse at the end of the Jewish revolt. But it seems more likely from the historical records that we have that the party itself developed later on in about AD 60-ish, and that led to the Jewish revolt there, in which case they would have just been inspired by Judas the Galilean. And one thing that we can say about the Zealots is that they were largely responsible for helping start the war, and they eventually conquered and maintained control of Jerusalem until AD 70, when the Roman general Titus came in and destroyed the entire city, destroying the temple and leaving it desolate. And so this group, it seems like they developed fairly late in the mindset of Jewish philosophies, but whenever they did develop, they eventually quickly led to the destruction of Jerusalem, because in their zeal, right, they're zealots, in their zeal, they bit off more than they could chew, and they opposed Rome, and Rome won. And this is stuff that Jesus predicted would happen. He talks about it in Matthew chapter 24, 25, stuff like that. It's something that the Bible had been predicting was going to happen. And Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, and this is a big formative shift in all of Israel. I mean, this is why we have Rabbinic Judaism to this day. This is why there's so much in Judaism is radically different nowadays. And to me, it's actually one of those things that reaffirms to me the fact that the Messiah had to come before AD 70, because there's so many prophecies about the Messiah that are given in the Old Testament that cannot be fulfilled right now. Because, first off, we don't have genealogical lists anymore. Because those were destroyed in the temple. And so it seems like the Messiah had to come before then. And it seems like the Zealots were primarily responsible for the ultimate collapse of Israel, which lasted for a long time period until Israel was restored as a nation in 1948? And so these people were very short-lived, but very, very influential. And so this leads us to our second question. Was Simon a zealot or a zealot? I put one version's a capital letter, one's a lowercase letter. Was he a big Z zealot, or was he a little z zealot? Was he part of the political party, or was he just a person who people could call a zealot because he was zealous for God? Let's wrestle through this. First and foremost, this is what we can say. Josephus asserts that the Zealot party was founded by Judas the Galilean in AD 6, which makes it possible that the Zealot party existed in the years prior to Simon following Jesus. So, if we take Josephus's words as saying that Judas the Galilean was officially the founder of the Zealot party, that means that this group would have existed at that time period, which means that Simon the Zealot very well could have been a member of that party. However, beyond Josephus, we have no evidence of the Zealot party being an official organized group prior to the First Jewish-Roman War in AD 66 to 70, ultimately ending in 73. So that kind of counters that a little bit. We don't know when this group officially developed, and that's going to make things very difficult when it comes to understanding whether or not Simon the Zealot was a part of this radical group. That being said, we got three things we can say. First off, it is possible that Simon belonged to the Zealot party of which Josephus speaks, in which case he serves as the earliest attestation to its existence. Because if he did belong to the Zealot party, that means that the Gospels actually give us our earliest reference to that party, because the Gospels were written before Josephus. And so that'd actually be really, really cool, but we don't know. Secondly, it is possible that Simon belonged to a different Zealot party, which preceded the extremist one of which Josephus speaks, and we'll talk about that in a second. Thirdly, it is possible that Simon was merely zealous, hence the Zealot. So it could be that maybe he wasn't even belonging to any political party. He was simply called the Zealot because he was known for his particular zeal for God that set him apart from the other people around him. And so all these things are possibilities, and when it comes to making a conclusion, we'll say this. While evidence seems to suggest Simon did not belong to the Zealot party, in the end, results are inconclusive. Ultimately, we can't say whether or not Simon the Zealot, the apostle we're talking about today, whether or not he actually belonged to the Zealot party. We can just say he was called the Zealot, and we have to wrestle through what that means. And so, before we move on to his biographical information, I thought I would read you some quotes from some smarter people than I am, just to let you know what their conclusions are, and maybe some of the explanations they have to offer, and some potential solutions that they have to provide. This is what John P. Meyer says in his book, A Marginal Jew, which is actually a series of books. He says this, it's pretty extended. At times, one comes across the affirmation, more often made than argued, that Simon was or had been a member of the Zealots, an organized group of ultranationalist freedom fighters who took up arms against the occupying forces of Rome. Sometimes this dubious interpretation is then parlayed into the suggestion that Jesus was a zealot, or at least was sympathetic to the zealot cause, though perhaps without taking up arms himself. So what he's pointing out here is that sometimes people just haphazardly just say, yeah, Simon the Zealot, he was a zealot, and they just make this claim, and as a result, they would actually suggest that maybe Jesus was sympathetic to that cause, which seems to contradict a lot of Jesus' teachings. He continues to say, although popular for its relevance, this position is highly questionable. The organized revolutionary faction that Josephus called the Zealots came into existence only during the First Jewish War, specifically during the winter of AD 67 to 68 in Jerusalem. He continues, the evangelists' attribution of the name Zealot reflects instead an older and broader use of the term kanana. We'll talk about that term in a second. A Jew who was intensely zealous for the practice of the Mosaic law and insistent that his fellow Jews strictly observe the law as a means of distinguishing and separating Israel, God's holy people, from the idolatry and immorality practiced by neighboring Gentiles. In imitation of Israelite heroes like Phinehas, the priest, Elijah the prophet, Jehu the king, and Mattathias the priest, these rigorists punished or even executed Jews who, in their eyes, were unfaithful to the Mosaic law. And so he actually raises up what I put here as the second possibility. He says that it actually could be that Simon belonged to an earlier group of zealots who weren't actually opposed to Rome. They were actually turning their attentions against fellow Jews who were not being as faithful to God as they should be. And so that actually seems like it's probably a stronger possibility in my own opinion, because we do have evidence of such a group existing, because Paul seems to kind of put himself amongst that group. He multiple times calls himself zealous for the law, and he says he was a Pharisee of Pharisees, right? So he was a Pharisee who took it to the natural, not natural, but he was a Pharisee who took those beliefs to the radical extremes, and as a result, he would turn against his fellow Jews who he thought were not following God adamantly enough, and amongst these are the Christians that he actually opposed, and he tried to wipe out the Christian church at that time period because he was a zealot. And so we do have evidence of this sort of group existing at the time of Jesus. Meyer concludes, we cannot be sure precisely how Simon may have manifested his zeal and to what extent his zeal may have involved violence, though we can safely rule out the anachronistic idea that he belonged to the organized group of zealots described by Josephus. And so he takes this, he says that the first possibility that I've listed here is not at all possible. I would say that we can't totally rule it out, but I would agree with him that it's very unlikely that Simon actually belonged to this group, just because it doesn't seem like we have any evidence other than him being called Simon the Zealot, that group existed at this time period. And once again, like I said a second ago, the Apostle Paul twice references himself as zealous in both Galatians chapter 1 and in Philippians chapter 3. In both instances, he is referring to his persecution of the early church, which would suggest to us that at the time period of the Gospels and the New Testament's writing, zealot actually applied to people who were opposed to fellow Jews, not necessarily opposed to Rome. Richard Bauckham, he says this in his book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It is now widely recognized that, since a specific political party with the name Zealots does not appear in our sources until after the outbreak of the Jewish revolt in 66 CE, Common Era, the term applied to Simon here must have the broader sense current in this period of zealot or a zealot for the law, compared to Acts chapter 21-22, often implying that such a person would take violent action to punish flagrant violation of the Torah. Such violence, however, would normally be aimed against fellow Jews rather than Romans. We should probably presume that Simon already bore this nickname before becoming a disciple of Jesus. So, Richard Bauckham comes to the same conclusion that John Meyer comes to. He says that the second possibility I've listed here is the most likely one. It's not that he was a zealot who was opposed to Rome, he was actually a zealot who would turn his zeal against fellow Jews for not following the law strictly enough, because that's the evidence that we have of zeal at the time period of Christ. And it seems like whenever the zeal finally turned against Rome, the people formed an organized party, they led a rebellion, and that was a very quick thing. So at this time period, it seems like the second possibility is the most likely. Sean McDowell, he says this. This is in his book, Fate of the Apostles. Simon may have been a member of the Zealots, but more likely he was zealous for the traditions of his predecessors and eagerly awaiting the fulfillment of the law. And so these three people that I have referenced here, they mainly land on the second and third possibilities here, the second and third options, as the most likely ones when it comes to who Simon the Zealot was. And I would probably land there as well. I would say that he probably was not a member of the actual Zealot party, like they portray him in The Chosen. I would say rather he was a zealot for the law who actually he had a very strict observance of the law that might have sometimes even turned him against his fellow Jews in a radical and extreme way. So he might have still been a radicalist and an extremist, but it wasn't necessarily turned against Rome. And so that really doesn't change that much of how we're going to view him in the Gospels, but it just kind of gives us a better historical understanding of who this guy might or might not have been. And having said all of that, at long last, we can move to his biographical information. And the reason I spent so much time on that other stuff is because we really are not going to have that much to say about Simon the Zealot when it comes to the text of Scripture. In fact, the first thing that we know about him is that his name is Shimon, or Simon. This comes from the Hebrew word Shimon, or Greek word Simon. And this means he has heard. And we have encountered this name once before in the list of the 12, and that comes from the Apostle Peter, who is also known as Simon Peter. And the reason we encounter this name so often is because Simon was the most popular name at this time period by a landslide. When you actually look into the historical records in first century Israel / Palestine / whatever you want to call it, at this time period, Simon was without a doubt the most popular name of those people. There are at least 8 other Simons in the Bible. First and foremost, we have Simeon, the son of Jacob, who we encounter in Genesis chapter 29, and he's the first person we encounter with this name. Simeon and Simon come from the same thing. And then we have 7 Simons mentioned in the New Testament alone. We have Simeon, the elderly man who prophesied over the infant Jesus in Luke chapter 2. We have Simon Peter, the lead apostle of Jesus, who we did a bunch of videos on at the beginning of this series. Then we have Simon the leper, a man in Bethany who hosted Jesus at his house in Matthew chapter 26. We have Simon the tanner, a man in Joppa who hosted Simon Peter in Acts chapter 9. We have Simon of Cyrene, a man who carried Jesus' cross in Luke chapter 23. We have Simon Magus, a magician confronted by Simon Peter in Acts chapter 8. And then we have Simon, the brother of Jesus, in Matthew chapter 13. And so there are 8 different people in the Bible named Simon or Simeon or Shimon, whatever you want to say there. And that's because 15.6% of men, 1 of every 6 men in this time period, was named either Simon or Joseph. Simon and Joseph were the leading names, and 1 out of every 6 people would have had either one of those 2 names. And you might ask, David, why was this name so popular at that time period? Well, I'll explain it to you. Or rather, Richard Bauckham will. This is what he says in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It is very striking that 6 of the 9 most popular male names are those of the Hasmonean family, Mattathias and his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judas, Eleazar, and Jonathan. While the 3 most popular female names, Mary, Miriam, Salome, and Shelemzion, the longer form of Salome, were also the names of members of the Hasmonean ruling family. Since it was the Hasmoneans who won Jewish independences in the 2nd century BCE, and were the last Jewish rulers of an independent Jewish state, the popularity of their names into the period of Roman rule was no doubt patriotic. And so this is what Richard Bauckham's suggestion is, and I think is a very good one. His hypothesis here is very brilliant. It seems like the most common names at this time period were a result of the Hasmonean or the Maccabean family that we encounter in the 2nd century BC, which is in between the two testaments. There's the Old Testament, which ends around 400 BC, and then there's the New Testament, which begins at the shift of the BC AD era. And during like the mid 100s BC, we have these people showing up, and they lead this revolt against pagan oppressors, which ultimately results in the deliverance of Israel and the establishment of the Feast of Dedication, also known as Hanukkah. There's this big family, they're called the Hasmoneans or the Maccabees, and basically these people were the celebrities of 1st century and intertestamental Judaism. This whole time period is called Second Temple Judaism. These guys were the celebrities at that time period, and so kind of like how we name a lot of our kids after celebrities, same thing there, and Simon was, by a landslide, the most popular name, and therefore we have two people amongst the apostles who are named Simon, and that means that these guys needed nicknames to differentiate between themselves. Simon Peter was called Peter to differentiate himself, and then Simon the Zealot was called the Zealot or the Canaanian, and that was to distinguish him from Simon Peter. And so let's talk about that nickname. It seems like these both mean the same thing, but if you're familiar with your Old Testament and stuff like that, you might read Canaanian and you might immediately think of the land of Canaan, which is the land of Israel. And some people suggest that's where it comes from, but more likely the term Canaanian, it comes from the Aramaic word kanana, which means jealous, in which case they actually refer to the same thing. In Matthew and Mark, he is referred to as Simon the Canaanian, and then in Luke and in Acts, he's referred to as the Zealot. So right here, I've got the Greek terms there. Matthew and Mark, they both use the term ha kananaios, whereas Luke wrote both Luke and Acts. Luke refers to him as ton kalumenon zeloten. Sorry, a little rusty on my Greek. Ton kalumenon zeloten, and in Acts, he calls him ha zelotes. Both of those mean zealot. You can hear it in there. Zeloten, zelotes, zealot. Matthew and Mark, they often use Aramaic transliteration in a lot of the different things that they say in their Gospels, whereas Luke seems to stray away from that because he's talking to a different type of community. And so it seems like both of these are referring to the same thing because the Aramaic term kanana, which would give us kananaios, that actually means jealous. In zeal and jealousy, they're very similar and they're interrelated, and so it seems like maybe these are just other ways of referring to the same guy. Matthew and Mark are using the Aramaic equivalent. This is what he would have actually been called at that time period because they would have spoken Aramaic, whereas Luke is using the term that would best convey this to a Greek-speaking audience. To the people who didn't necessarily know the Aramaic, they would be able to read this. They'd say, oh, zealot, we know what that is, whereas they wouldn't know what kananaios meant, right? They wouldn't know that, oh, that's the Aramaic word for jealousy. And so you can see why they would refer to these, but if you encounter those different names, you have to realize they kind of mean the same thing. And Richard Bauckham says this: the list of the 12 in Mark and Matthew give a Greek transliteration of the Aramaic term, whereas Luke translates it as the zealot. So Matthew and Mark give us a transliteration. Luke gives us an actual translation to help his readers understand what is being conveyed by who Simon is. And so that's his name. That's his nickname. What else do we know about Simon? Nothing. We know absolutely nothing else when it comes to Simon's biographical information. We don't know his parents' names. We don't know if he had any siblings. In the show, they present him as having a sibling named Jesse, who, in The Chosen, they present him as having a sibling named Jesse, and this is actually the paralytic guy, or the lame man, that Jesus healed at the pool of Bethesda. But we don't know that according to Scripture. That's just a fictional embellishment that they made in the show just to help tie the storylines together and to introduce Simon the Zealot. But that's not biblical, right? We don't know anything about his family. We don't know if he was married. We don't know if he got married later on. We don't know if he was married at the time he followed Jesus. We have no way of knowing. We don't know where he grew up. We don't know where he lived. We don't know what type of education he had. We don't know what his occupation was. If he was a zealot, like according to the political party sense of it, according to the philosophy, well, that might have been his occupation. Maybe he was a local terrorist, because that's kind of what zealots were. But we really just do not know anything about this guy other than that he was described as a zealot. We have good reason to think that maybe he spoke Aramaic because that was the language of that time period in that region. And he probably understood Greek and Hebrew as well, because people living in that region, especially in the Galilean region, they seem to have been familiar with that stuff, just given the various needs of that culture. And so it's very possible that he spoke that and was familiar with the other two languages, but we just don't know. We have no way, because Simon the Zealot, he doesn't show up a lot in Scripture. And so his biographical information is something that we can cover very, very quickly, which leads us to our next question. How old was Simon? This is a question that we have been asking in every single one of these videos, and that's just because I find it so intriguing. But because we don't know that much about Simon the Zealot, we can just make general assumptions or questions or hypotheses about his age, the same ones that we've made about a lot of the other apostles. And so I'm going to put these all up on here. If you want more details on this, go to some of the earlier videos in this series where I actually spend time breaking this stuff down. But we can say this. Jesus was around 30 years old when he began his ministry, and that was the typical age of a rabbi. Students were usually younger than the rabbis, and Jesus refers to them as little children, so we have good reason to think that these guys were less than 30 years old at the time they began following Jesus, just because he calls them little children, and that was the typical custom of that time period. Education ended between ages 12 and 15, and some of the disciples were already practicing trades. If Simon was called a zealot before following Jesus, that means that he must have been at least old enough to have kind of made a name for himself and to be known as a zealot, and so that would suggest that maybe he was a little bit older than 12 at the time he began following. And so we have maybe good reason to think he was between 14 and 30, somewhere in there. But then as we continue, as far as we know, Simon was the only one married at that time, at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And the average age for marriage was 18 years old. And so we have good reason to think that maybe if Simon was the only one married, all the other guys were under 18 at that time period. That's not certain. None of this is certain. But giving our best guess, that's what we can say. And as far as we know, by the third year of Jesus' ministry, Simon was the only one who had to pay the temple tax, which began at age 20. And that would suggest to us that maybe all the other apostles, other than Simon, were under the age of 17 or even really 16 when they began to follow Jesus, because by the third year, they would have had to have been under the age of 20. And so when it comes to our conclusions, most of the disciples were likely young teenagers at the time they began following Christ, and Simon was also likely a young teenager at the time he began following Christ. And I put ages 14 to 16. We don't know, but that is probably our best guess as of right now. And I mainly include this slide on every single one of them because I think it's important for us to kind of consider this. It's different than how the apostles are typically portrayed. I think it says a lot about what can be accomplished by the youth, both back then and nowadays. And I think whenever you look throughout Scripture, you realize that God uses the youth a lot more than we typically think. And we try to coddle the youth a little bit more, and we think we have to entertain them in our churches, when really I think God says treat them with respect and guide them to me. I think that God's view of the youth is actually a lot more respectful than our view of them is nowadays. We try to feed them with a silver spoon, and God's like, no, just give them me, and that'll be enough. And it also just shows us that they can accomplish a lot of things, both good and bad, as we'll talk about Judas Iscariot next week. Sometimes youth can do pretty bad things. And I think it also helps us understand Scripture a little bit more. There's a lot of debates that start developing between the apostles that I think are best explained if you understand that they're probably young guys. Because if you've ever been a young teenager, which, I mean, everybody has to go through that. So if you're an adult right now, you went through these years, you'll know that you get into foolish debates like some of the stuff that they went through. And so I think a lot of the stuff that we read about the 12 apostles in the Gospels makes a lot of sense if they were younger. It seems like maybe Simon Peter was the oldest of them, and then maybe James and John were the youngest, and all the other ones were probably around 14 to 16 at the time that they began to follow Jesus. And that's all we can really say about his age, and all of that is just hypothetical. We don't know for sure. Let's move on. Simon the Zealot in the Gospels. We're going to have a lot to talk about here, so buckle up. Just kidding. Simon the Zealot is consistently listed in the third group of the 12, with his name always appearing next to Thaddeus, Judas of James. And the reason why I'm starting with this is because Simon isn't mentioned anywhere else in the Gospels. He's only mentioned in the lists, and that's why we know nothing about him, really. All we know is that he always appears in this third group of the apostles, and that he always appears next to Thaddeus, who is also known as Judas of James. That's the guy who we talked about in the last video. I won't spend much time on him right now, because I don't need to. Just go watch the other video. But what I will say is, I'll summarize this. It seems like the groups of the 12 were separated into three different groups, and the reason why scholars just debate about. It could just be that this was a mnemonic way of people trying to remember the list, right? So it's like you just separate them into groups of 4, and that was an easier way to remember the list of 12. But it also seems to be that maybe this was a way of remembering the power structure that Jesus kind of had established within the group. So Simon Peter is the leader of the first group, Philip is the leader of the second group, and James, son of Alphaeus, is the leader of the third group. And it seems like Simon the Zealot would have belonged to that third group. So that's something we know about him. But in addition to that, all we know is that, like the rest of the 12, Simon was appointed by Jesus to become a follower of him. And so despite the fact that we don't know that much about Simon, we have to realize that he was still one of the most crucial and important figures in the early church, because Jesus handpicked him as one of his 12 closest apostles. I mean, just think about that. We don't know that much about him, but he was one of Jesus' 12 closest friends, one of his 12 closest followers. Whenever people were going to come up and they were going to ask a question about Jesus, he was one of the 12 people in all the world that they would have gone to ask. I think it's pretty cool. We also know that he traveled with Jesus for 3.5 years, which is an amazing, amazing privilege. He received insight to Jesus' teachings, which is an even more amazing privilege, right? There are some things that Jesus would withhold from other people, but he would tell the 12. He was sent out to preach in Jesus' name, right? He would have gone out and preached the gospel. He would have baptized people. Jesus didn't baptize people, but his apostles did. He would have gone out and performed miracles in Jesus' name, which is really cool, something that we often don't think about when it comes to the members of the 12 apostles. But during Jesus' ministry, he gave them the ability to go out and perform miracles. And I hope we see that in The Chosen Season 3. Because I do believe in Season 3, they're going to be sending them out to 2 by 2 and ministering. And so we might see them performing some miracles. We also know that as a member of the 12, he would have been challenged by Jesus' teachings, because it does seem like again and again they were constantly being challenged by the things he said, just as we are. And he also would have heard Christ predict his death multiple times. Jesus predicted his death at least 3 times, but he also, he predicted it overtly 3 times, but he also alluded to it many times before it actually came about. And so Jesus actually prophesied that he would die and come back to life, and the apostles heard that. They just didn't understand it, or they didn't take it seriously. And that's why he would have also fled at Christ's arrest, because all the 12 fled. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. All the apostles, they fled whenever Christ was arrested, and we don't encounter them again until the resurrection of Christ. But that's the beauty of it. Like the rest of the 12, he saw the resurrected Christ. And I guess technically this is like the rest of the 11, because at this point Judas Iscariot would be dead. And once again, I'm not looking forward to talking about Judas next week. And I might end up having to split that into 2 videos because I have a lot to say about Judas. I'm not sure. I haven't decided yet. But he would have seen the resurrected Christ. And so he would have had a time to repent. He would have had an opportunity to be restored to God, restored to Christ in fellowship. And so that's beautiful. And like the rest of the 12, Simon would have been present at the ascension of Christ, whenever he ascended to the Father and left them with that great commission to go out and make disciples of all the nations. And so we have a mixed bag here, but we don't know anything else about Simon. All we can do is make generalities about him that we would say about the rest of the 12 apostles. And so let's move on and let's talk about Simon the Zealot in Acts and the Epistles. Unfortunately, Simon the Zealot is only mentioned once in the book of Acts and is never mentioned in the Epistles. I put Judas of James here because, once again, I am silly and I forgot to take this out. He is listed next to Judas of James, but he is not Judas of James. That was something from the last presentation that I just forgot to fix. That's just supposed to say chapter 1, verse 13, because that's where he's mentioned, but Judas of James is not him. I just missed that whenever I was editing these things. I usually just kind of copy and paste the former presentation and just edit it for this one, so that's my bad. I'm not perfect. Nobody is. So Simon the Zealot is only mentioned once in the book of Acts, and so the same thing with the book of Acts as with, basically the same thing with the whole New Testament as with the Gospels. We just have to make assumptions about him based off of what we know about the rest of the 12. Along with the rest of the apostles, Simon would have been present at the ascension of Christ. Where we leave him in the Gospels, is where we also meet him in the book of Acts. He's at the ascension of Christ. He's saying, Lord, are you going to establish your kingdom right now? Jesus says, yeah, y'all don't understand what's happening. And so he ascends, and then some angels show up and say, hey guys, go get to work, go share Jesus. And so they do. He would have been there whenever they replaced Judas Iscariot, and they found another 12th apostle, Matthias. And there's debate about whether they should have done that or not. I think it wasn't a problem, but a lot of people think it was. But yeah, and so he would have been there for that. He would have been there when the Spirit fell at Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, and therefore he would have been present whenever Peter delivered the first sermon at Pentecost in that same chapter. So, the Spirit descends like tongues of fire, and they start speaking in all these different languages. And this is this amazing story that's very similar to the descending of God upon Mount Sinai after the Exodus. And then they go and they start issuing out this new covenant, very similar to how God gave them the old covenant at Mount Sinai. He would have been present in the establishing of the Jerusalem church that we see at the end of Acts chapter 2, where they held all things in common, much like the Essenes that we talked about earlier in this video. And he would have been present as the Jerusalem church continued to grow in Acts chapter 4. He would have been there whenever the high priest began to arrest the apostles. We read about that in Acts chapter 5. So first off, we have them arresting Peter and John, and then they're freed. But then later on, they start arresting the 12 in general. And then he would have been there whenever they appointed the 7 deacons, because the church was getting so big that they needed more people to start helping out with leadership. And so they appointed 7 deacons, amongst whom were people like Stephen and another deacon named Philip. Stephen becomes the first martyr. Philip's the one who takes the gospel to the Samaritans and stuff like that. And so he would have been there. And other than that, we don't really know anything else about Simon when it comes to the text of the Bible. We have good reason to think that maybe he would have stayed in Jerusalem or in that region for maybe the first 14 or so years after Christ's death and resurrection and ascension. Because it seems like most of the apostles were there. They were establishing the Jerusalem church, and it wasn't until massive persecution broke out again that they actually fled, right? So it seems like whenever Stephen was killed, that was the first wave of persecution. That was primarily led by this guy named Saul of Tarsus, also known as Paul. Saul was his Hebrew name, Paul was his Greek name. And that guy leads the first wave of persecution, but Saul eventually comes to Christ, and he actually starts taking the gospel to the Gentiles and stuff, which is even crazier. And then the persecution kind of comes to an end for a few years, maybe for about 10 years. And then a second wave of persecution breaks out whenever Herod Agrippa has James, son of Zebedee, killed. And that's the first one of the apostles to be killed. And now that the threat's becoming more imminent and more dangerous, the 12 apostles, they finally part ways from one another, and they go spread out throughout the world to start sharing the gospel. And that's why we don't really hear about them as much in the Bible, because we follow Peter a little bit, but after that the primary focus becomes on the Apostle Paul, because it's taking the gospel out into the world. And so we just don't hear about these other guys because it seems like they weren't so focused on writing their stuff down as they were just sharing the stuff orally. And so we just really don't know that much about them from the biblical canon. And so that means that we have to stop talking about the Bible and start talking about tradition. Let's talk about Simon the Zealot according to tradition, and let's wrap this up. First and foremost, let's talk about travels and traditions. And the first thing we have to say is that traditionally, Simon the Zealot is often confused with Simon, son of Clopas, who is mentioned in John chapter 19, verse 25, which makes it difficult to determine the legitimacy of many of the traditions. You see this in Hippolytus on the 12 and also in the Acts of Simon of Cananaean. And this is something that we're going to encounter as we talk about a lot of these traditions. And this is very similar to what we've seen with some of the other apostles. We saw this with Matthew and Matthias. They often get confused. We saw this with Philip the apostle and Philip the deacon, or Philip the evangelist. These guys also got confused. And we also saw this with the Jameses whenever it comes to their traditions. And so it seems like just how we also wrestle through who's who and where's where in the Bible, it seems like the early church also wrestled through that, and oftentimes they would get things confused, which makes sense because they didn't have the ability to Google things like we do, and so their resources were a lot more limited back then than we have nowadays, and so we actually probably know more about these guys than they did because they were very limited in their resources, and that's why we have the rise of modern scholarship and stuff, which is both a good and a bad thing. And so, to demonstrate this confusion, I was going to read from Hippolytus. This is what he says. Simon the Zealot, the son of Clopas, who is also called Jude, became bishop of Jerusalem after James the Just and fell asleep and was buried there at the age of 120 years. And so in that one statement, it's one sentence, but it seems like he gets confused multiple times. He says that Simon the Zealot is the same person as Simon, son of Clopas, which, that is actually possible. We don't know if Simon the Zealot, I actually couldn't find any arguments against this, so it is very possible that Simon the Zealot is Simon, son of Clopas. We just don't know. But it does seem like traditionally people did distinguish between them, and so whenever they're put next to each other, that seems to be more the product of confusion. But I will admit, we don't know that for sure. But then he also follows this up by saying that this guy is also known as Jude, which we would say is just entirely wrong, because Jude seems to have been the other name for Judas, son of James, aka Thaddeus, who we talked about last week. And so that's where we get some doubt about everything that Hippolytus is saying here, because it just seems like he's very, very confused, right? So whenever he says Simon the Zealot, son of Clopas, you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But then he says, also known as Jude, you're like, oh, okay, this guy might not know what he's talking about. And so it's possible that Simon the Zealot is Simon, son of Clopas, but we have good reason to think that maybe he's not, and that actually was just an early confusion amongst the early church as they're trying to reconcile this, when in reality, there were so many people named Simon, it's not too far out of the realm of possibility that they were different people. It's very difficult to determine where Simon the Zealot traveled, and therefore we're not going to have a lot about travels and traditions here, because what we see is that we just have a tough time knowing what's about him and what's not, right? Who's who, where's where in the Bible? It's hard when it comes to Simon the Zealot. We get confused about who he is, and we get confused about where he traveled. According to Eastern tradition, Simon ministered in Jerusalem, Samaria, Egypt, and in Georgia, and we read about this in books such as the Acts of Simon of Canaan and in the Breviarium Apostolorum. According to the second one, the Breviarium Apostolorum, this is what that says. Simon Zealotes, which means the Zealous, was first called the Cananean, burning with zeal for God. He was Peter's namesake and equal to him in honor. He received the guidance over Egypt, and he is said to have held the chair of Jerusalem after James the Just. After 120 years, he was worthy to suffer the martyrdom of passion through the cross during Hadrian's reign. And so what we see right here is that he, once again, whoever's writing the Breviarium Apostolorum, they're sharing that same tradition that we read about in Hippolytus a second ago, where Simon the Zealot is the one who takes up the reins after James the Just dies. James the Just, he's the person who we would say was the brother of Jesus. He's the guy who wrote the book of James in the New Testament. He was the leader of the Jerusalem church in the early years of the church after the apostles went out and started ministering. It seems like Jesus' brother stayed behind and he was the leading pastor of that church. And it says that after James was martyred, Simon the Zealot is the one who ascended and became the new pastor. However, that's where we see, once again, it seems like there's a confusion between Simon the Zealot and Simon son of Clopas. It seems like the apostles were the ones who were charged to take the gospels to the nations, so they would have dispersed. Whereas Simon son of Clopas seems to have been a different person who actually would have stayed there. And since we have Simon son of Clopas mentioned in John chapter 19, we have good reason to think that maybe he was somebody who would be familiar to the people in Jerusalem, which might suggest they were two different Simons. We don't know though, and so that's where we have to wrestle through this and be like, what can we know? I don't know. It's very confusing. And so the reason I include all this stuff is because I want y'all to know that a lot of this stuff is very ambiguous, and I don't want us to overstate our case, because I think that's actually pretty dangerous when we overstate our case. It's fine to mention these various traditions, just don't overstate it and say that we know adamantly about these guys, because we really don't. This is what Sean McDowell concludes. He says, another Eastern tradition claims Simon the Zealot and Matthias came along with Andrew on his third missionary trip to Georgia. And so in this case, Simon the Zealot and Matthias, the guy who replaced Judas Iscariot, they would have traveled with Andrew to Georgia, and that's going to be important whenever we get to the, the fate of Simon in a second. But that's the Eastern tradition. So Eastern tradition says that Simon ministered in Jerusalem, Samaria, Egypt, and Georgia. As for the Western tradition, it says that Simon ministered in Persia and in Britain, and I actually wanted to spend a little bit of time explaining the whole Britain tradition, because this is actually kind of interesting to me. This is what Thomas E. Schmidt says in his book, The Apostles After Acts, a sequel. He says, is an apostolic missionary venture to the northern fringes of the empire out of the question? First century Roman roads were excellent, and it was a time of relative peace. By land, it's about 2,600 miles from Jerusalem to London. At this pace, the journey could be made on foot in 4 months, or 6 months with fewer miles per day or longer stops. By sea, the journey is quicker, but perhaps more hazardous. Now, take a dozen young men determined to propagate the gospel throughout the empire and give them about 50 years to accomplish it, say AD 35 to AD 85, for a total of 600 man-years. It is unreasonable to think, is it unreasonable to think of just one of those years being devoted to Britain and one more to Gaul? And so this guy, he's actually just asking a hypothetical question, because some people might hear that the gospel was taken to Britain, and you're like, well, that's really far from Jerusalem. Like, I feel like they would have been a little bit more focused, because this is probably the most distant that we've seen of any of the apostles going, other than perhaps Thomas going to India. And so you might be like, I don't know. But this guy, he's not actually giving us any historical data that reflects this. He's actually just saying it's not out of the question. I mean, these guys, there's 11 or 12 different guys all going in different directions. Let's say that they have 50 years to do this. That's 600 years total. 12 times 50, right? 600 years to share the gospel. Is it out of the question that one of those years would be devoted to Britain and Gaul? Not necessarily. And so it is very possible, hypothetically speaking, that he did go to Britain. And there are traditions that say this. This is what Sean McDowell concludes. He says, Tertullian was an early church father in the 2nd century. Tertullian mentions Christians in Britain at the end of the 2nd century. We have good reason to believe then that Christianity had arrived in Britain by the late 2nd century, but evidence of its existence there in the 1st century is much more difficult to ascertain. While Simon might possibly have traveled to Britain, evidence is scant. And so we don't really know whether or not he did travel to Britain. There are late traditions that claim that he did, but we just don't know. I mean, the first tradition that says this is Synopsis de Apostol, which comes from AD 300, right? So this is the 4th century. We have a tradition suggesting that Simon did take the gospel to Britain, and it's not out of the realms of possibility. We just don't have any evidence of there being Christians in Britain in the 1st century. And so that's where we just don't know. It's more of an argument from silence, but it is possible that he did go to Britain, which is kind of cool if you ask me. But ultimately, going back to this right here, it is very difficult to determine where Simon the Zealot traveled. We just don't know. We'd like to know, but we don't. And so we'll turn to the fate of Simon the Zealot, and we will wrap up this video. There are many traditions regarding Simon the Zealot's fate, and I think I'm going to list 7 of them here. I believe I've got 7 of them. The first one is that he died of old age, presumably, in Jerusalem, and this comes from Hippolytus on the 12 in the 4th century. This is what he says. I read this a second ago, but I'm going to read it again. Simon the Zealot, the son of Clopas, who is called Jude, became bishop of Jerusalem after James the Just, and he fell asleep and was buried there at the age of 120. So once again, he does seem to be confused a little bit because he equates Simon the Zealot to Simon son of Clopas to Jude, and in reality, it seems like those are actually all 3 different people. It's possible that the first 2 are the same, but it seems like they're all 3 different people. So he seems largely confused here, but his suggestion is that, and it's a pretty early suggestion, this is in the 4th century, so this is during the 300s. His suggestion is that he died in Jerusalem, but he never actually specifies how he died. He just says that he was 120 years old, which might lead us to believe he died of old age. A second tradition is that he was crucified under Trajan, and this comes from the Coptic Acts of Simon of Cananaean. In that book, we read that he ministers in Jerusalem and Samaria before being crucified under Trajan after being accused of magic. It doesn't actually specify where he was crucified. It just says that he ministered in those regions, Jerusalem and Samaria, and then he was crucified during the time period of Trajan, which leads us to our third tradition, which is that he was martyred under Hadrian, who was another Roman emperor. This is what the Breviarium Apostolorum says. After 120 years, he was worthy to suffer the martyrdom of passion through the cross during Hadrian's reign. So once again, he says that he was crucified under Hadrian. He suffered the martyrdom of passion through the cross, right? So once again, crucifixion under these different people. The only thing that directly contradicts between these accounts is the emperor, right? That's something I want to highlight with these first 3. These 3 actually line up fairly well, and they're fairly early traditions, which might lead us to believe that they might actually have a realm of truth to them. It just could be that they're getting these people confused. That's the main thing that makes it unreliable, because, I mean, one of the earliest ones we have says that Simon Zealot is the Simon of Clopas and is Jude, and we just know that one of those things is for sure wrong, unless we're just totally off. But the only thing that directly contradicts between these 3 is which emperor was in charge at that time period. Each one seems to place his death in Jerusalem, right? This one explicitly says his death was in Jerusalem, and these 2, they don't mention where the death was at, but they do mention that he ministered in Jerusalem, which would suggest that maybe that is where he died, much like Christ. 2 accounts place him dying at the age of 120. The first and third one, right? The one Hippolytus says he died at 120, and in the Breviarium Apostolorum, it also says he died at 120, so that is consistent as well. The first account doesn't specify how he died, and the last 2 accounts both say that he suffered crucifixion of martyrdom. And so, all of these seem to kind of reconcile with one another a little bit. And then, this is what we can say. This is just kind of my own little hypothesis here. Trajan ruled from AD 98 to AD 117, and Hadrian ruled from AD 117 to AD 138. If these reports are to be believed, it could be possible that he died somewhere around the transition between those 2 powers. That would have put him as dying around the age of 120, depending on how old he was at the time he began following Jesus. This would suggest that maybe he was around Jesus' age, and that he actually ministered until maybe around AD 117, and at that time period, he would have been about 120 years old, which is a really, really long life. But that is possible, and that could explain why there's confusion about who he died under. Did he die under Trajan or Hadrian? Maybe it was around that transition time period. I don't know. I could just be trying to justify this, but that is a possibility. And if that is the case, this would make Simon the Zealot the longest lived apostle, since it seems like even the apostle John died before the turn of the 1st century. So this would have Simon the Zealot outliving almost all of the apostles by about 20 years. And so that in and of itself would be remarkable, because not only did he die at 120, but he would have died martyrdom at 120, which is just crazy. I mean, just let the guy die of old age at that point. I mean, just give him another year. He's probably gone. And so those are our first 3 accounts. And so that was me just trying to reconcile those, because I think that there is a way to reconcile them. But once again, they could be talking about a different Simon altogether. And it seems like from the very earliest traditions, people were getting Simon the Zealot mixed up with other people. And that's because they probably didn't know much about Simon the Zealot either. The 4th tradition we have is that he died in Abkhazia, Georgia. This comes from the Georgian tradition, and according to this tradition, Simon died in Abkhazia after ministering throughout Georgia alongside Matthias and Andrew. This is what we mentioned in the last slide, where we talked about him going to Georgia with Matthias and Andrew. Well, it seems like it talks about Matthias's death, and then it talks about how Simon also went on to die in Abkhazia, and then he was buried somewhere else. And I think Andrew in this story actually continues to go minister, and then he eventually is martyred as well. Fifthly, we have a tradition that he was killed by priests in Persia. And this comes from the Latin Passio Simonis et Judei. And this is what Sean McDowell says about this tradition. He says, according to this tradition, Simon and Thaddeus travel around preaching, performing miracles, and countering the magic of Zeroes and Arphaxad. Priests and others attacked and killed them for refusing to offer sacrifices to the gods of the sun and moon. The author shows familiarity with the 4th century Persian kingdom, which provides a terminus post quem for its origin. And so what he's suggesting is that we don't know exactly when this tradition developed, but we do know that the earliest it could be is the 4th century, because some of the things that the guy's talking about reflect 4th century Persian culture. And so it had to be at least the 4th century, but it might have also been written later. And so that's the earliest this tradition could develop, but it is at least a little bit consistent with the Gospels in the sense that it pairs Simon the Zealot with Thaddeus. And like we mentioned when we were looking at the Gospels, those two's name, they always show up right next to each other. And so that is very possible that this is rooted in a layer of truth. And that's what we have to remember with a lot of these traditions. These don't have to all be entirely wrong or entirely right. There could be traces of truth in all of these. Maybe he didn't die in these places, but maybe he didn't minister in them and then move on, and then maybe a martyrdom account was developed later on in those places. We just don't know, and that's really the difficulty when it comes to history. History doesn't work like science, where we can replicate it and test its validity. History is a one-time thing where we just have to look at our sources and try to determine the likelihood of whether or not these things occurred. And with the Gospels, the things that are described in the Gospels, we have good reason to believe that they are true and valid, and that gives us motivation to believe in the inspiration of God and the work of the Holy Spirit on the work of Scripture. When it comes to these traditions, they're not nearly as consistent, which I think, if anything, that should give us a lot of joy when it comes to trusting the Scriptures, because the Bible was written by over 40 different authors in 3 different continents in 3 different languages over the span of about 1,500 years. Yet there's not a single contradiction in all of Scripture, and it's all based around one story about one man who came to save the world and restore people back to God. That's the Bible, right? That's just amazing. I'm just going to take a second to fangirl on the Bible, because even the earliest traditions about the apostles, they couldn't get their story straight. There's so many contradictions, and that shows how impressive it is that the Bible is consistent. Nowadays, you look at some of the most ambitious artistic projects of the modern era. I mean, look at the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's something that has been developed since 2008, right? It's been 13 years, and they've done this amazing thing that is unparalleled in modern cinema or in modern art. It's never happened at all. Over the course of 13 years, they've developed like this amazing universe with all these stories and backstories and all this stuff. Yet even within those 13 years, there's all these contradictions within the stories. There's plot holes. There's things that just don't work. And that's all being figureheaded by one guy. And they have all this communication. They've got the internet. They've got all their resources where they can go look back at this and make sure it's consistent. And even then, there's these plot holes. There's all these breaks in the story. There's all these things that don't make sense. The Bible was written during a time period where such communication was not existent. And it was written by 40 different people over 1,500 years, 3 different continents, 3 different languages. yet it's all consistent and it's all revolving around one story. That testifies to the miraculous origins of the Bible. I think that's so, so cool. And I think the fact that these traditions that develop shortly after the conclusion of the Bible are so varied, and the fact that we don't know much about them and we don't know which ones are right, I think that in and of itself is a testament to how amazing the Bible is. And so rather than being frustrated by the differences here, I actually would use these differences to point us back to our assurance in the validity of Scripture. And so if you find yourself getting frustrated by this, take heart. Take a moment to reflect and just think about how awesome God is, because these traditions and how the apostles died, that really isn't that important. What is important is that the Bible is trustworthy, and we have good reason to think the Bible is trustworthy. This stuff, it doesn't matter that much. We would like to know more than we do, but it's fine that we don't. And it's good to be content with the mystery of it. Sixthly, we have a tradition that he was martyred in Variospore, Persia. And I don't know where Variospore is, and whenever I tried to look it up, the only account I could ever find with this being mentioned is in the history of Armenia, talking about Simon the Zealot. And so, as far as I know, this is the only occasion we have of this city being mentioned at all. And so, that's kind of cool. But this is what it says in the history of Armenia. As to Simon the Zealot, who was sent unto Persia, I cannot relate with certainty what he did, nor where he suffered martyrdom. It is said that one Simon, an apostle, was martyred at Variospore. Right? And so, this account, it says, I don't know what he did here. I don't know how he was martyred, but we do have an account that he was martyred. And so, to me, that actually is very encouraging, because this guy at least seems to admit that he doesn't know all the facts, which would suggest to me that maybe he isn't as biased as some of these other people are. He's not trying to come up with something. He's just saying, I don't know. I just received this tradition that he died here. That's all I got. And so that actually is very motivational to me, that might give credence to that. But we don't know when this was really written, and so I'm not going to linger on that too much. Seventhly and lastly, we do have a tradition that he was crucified in Britain. This is not the last tradition that we have about Simon the Zealot's fate. I'm actually going to mention a few more in my final conclusion. But this is the seventh final one that's kind of more of a major tradition or an earlier one. And this comes from the Synopsis Dei Apostol in AD 300, right? This is the earliest reference to him being crucified, or him being in Britain at all. And this comes from a guy named Dorotheus, who was the bishop of Tyre, and he's writing in AD 300 in this book called Synopsis Dei Apostol, and this is what he says. Simon Zelotes traversed all Mauritania and all the regions of the Africans, preaching Christ. He was at last crucified, slain, and buried in Britain. And so some people will debate about this because we don't have any evidence of people being crucified in Britain, specifically because crucifixion was primarily a Roman practice. But that doesn't mean that it was out of the realms of possibility. And so really we don't know, but that is a fairly early tradition. I mean, this is the 4th century, but see how we have contrasting things here. Both of these are from the 4th century. One says he died at 120 in Jerusalem. One says that he was crucified in Britain. Very different places, very different ways of death. We just don't know. We ultimately do not know, and so that leads us to our conclusion. We can't be 100% sure as to how or when Simon the Zealot died. And so we'll conclude this video by looking at Sean McDowell's conclusions. And what I like, the reason why I include his, is because he does what a good historian does with his conclusions. He doesn't just say this is right or wrong. He just kind of puts it on a rank. I think he has 9 different levels that he puts things on. He says most probably true or something like that. Like he's got most probably true, most likely false, stuff like that, to where he's got like a realm of 9 different rankings that he gives things, where he talks about possibility, probability, all that stuff, or he says as plausible as not, things like that, just because that's how we have to work with history. Once again, it's not like science, to where we can't say adamantly this did or didn't happen. We can just talk about different degrees of confidence, and that's how he concludes all of his chapters on the apostles. He tells us our degrees of confidence that we have concerning their fates. And so in regards to Simon the Zealot engaging in missionary work outside Jerusalem, he says this is very probably true, because we have a lot of traditions suggesting that he did go out and he did minister outside Jerusalem like the rest of the apostles did. And so he's not saying this is the highest probability of truth, but it's very probably true, because that is consistent with what we see in the traditions, and it's consistent with and it is consistent with what Jesus told them to do, and it's consistent with what we see with the other apostles. As for him experiencing martyrdom, he says this is as plausible as not, because we have some traditions that say he was martyred, we have some that say he was not, and that he just died peacefully, and so really we just can't say. We don't have any tradition saying that he recanted his faith, and so that's motivational. But we just don't have enough early traditions saying one or the other. We've got later traditions that say a mixture of both, and so it's plausible that he died martyr's death. It's plausible that he did not. Let's not overstate our case. And this is what he says in conclusion. We do know that history has often confused Simon the Zealot with Simon son of Clopas. As with the other apostles, for example, Philip, this confusion makes it difficult to judge what traditions genuinely apply to the apostle. Second, a variety of traditions exist which tell of his journeys as well as his fate. Third, a variety of means for his fate claim he was crucified, slain with a sword, hacked to death with an axe, and even died peacefully. Finally, we have no strong local traditions for Simon, as seen for Thomas in India or Bartholomew and Thaddeus in Armenia. Clearly, he might have died as a martyr, but it's also possible that he died peacefully. And so, in conclusion, we have to say, we don't know how he died. He could have died a martyr, he could have died peacefully, and that is the thing that we can say about Simon the Zealot. Thank you once again for joining me for this video. It's kind of sad for me that we're coming to our conclusion of this whole series, but I'm very excited for what we have coming up next, and I guess I can just tell you about it right now. This could always change, but I believe the thing that I'm planning on doing next, it's going to take me a little bit to prepare for it, but I believe my goal after this is to start walking through the books of the prophets, the Old Testament prophets. We're going to start with the major prophets, then work our way into the minor prophets, and we're just going to talk about the overall stories and the overall messages of these guys. And the reason why I want to do that is going to be kind of like a Bible study. We're not going to go as in-depth into them as I would like to, but we're still going to go fairly in-depth because I want us to understand their messages and I want us to understand what's going on in those books. Because first off, as Christians, a lot of the times we don't spend much time in the Old Testament. And if we ever spend time in the prophets, typically we're only talking about the messianic prophecies that talk about Jesus. But for those of y'all who really like The Chosen, you'll realize very quickly on in that show that the prophets and the prophecies found therein, those shaped Jewish culture. And so if you're wanting to understand The Chosen more, you've got to understand the prophets. You really have to understand the whole Old Testament. I'm just starting with the prophets to start giving us a foundation, and maybe eventually I'll do some of the other books. But you'll understand if you're watching The Chosen, prophecies are very, very important, and I'm wanting us to understand the culture that existed at the time of Jesus. And if you want to understand that, the prophecies are the place to go, because those books are the ones that really shape the expectations of the Jewish people at that time period. But I don't only want that to be for the sake of The Chosen, because The Chosen ultimately is secondary when it comes to my realms of interest. My main goal is to help people understand the Bible and what's taught therein, and therefore I just want to talk about the prophets because I like talking about the Bible, and I want us to understand that. I believe that you cannot truly understand the New Testament unless you understand the Old Testament. In a lot of ways, the way I view the Bible is this. I view the Bible like a workbook. The Old Testament is the one with all the Old Testament is the section with all the questions that you have to fill out. It gives you questions, you're looking for the answers, and it basically ends without the answers actually being provided. The New Testament is kind of like the appendix at the end that gives you all the answers to the questions. And so, to me, the Old Testament is the thing we really have to focus on, and the New Testament is the thing that gives us the answers after we've read through the Old Testament. Unfortunately, as Christians, a lot of times we mainly focus on the New Testament, and in a way that's kind of cheating. You know, your professors aren't going to like you if you just always go straight to the answer key. No, you have to wrestle through the Old Testament, and so I have a very strong passion for the Old Testament because it helps us understand the New Testament, and the New Testament helps us understand the Old Testament. The Old Testament is the New Testament concealed. The New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And so I really want to spend time helping us understand the Old Testament because I think that will give us a much richer foundation by which to understand the New Testament so that whenever you get to the Gospels, you understand what's going on. I mean, literally, you go to Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, and you cannot understand the very first verse of the New Testament unless you have at least a little bit of understanding of the Old Testament. So I want to spend some time going through the Old Testament because eventually on this channel, I would like to do an in-depth, deep dive of the New Testament, specifically of the Gospels, because I love the Gospels. That is my main area of focus. That's what I want to spend most of my time teaching about. But in order to grasp that, we need to understand the Old Testament, and so I'm really excited to spend time talking about the prophets in the series that I've got planned after we finish up this Lives of the Apostles. But that being said, that's what I'm planning on doing. But we're not there yet. We still have one more apostle to talk about, and that is going to be Judas Iscariot. Like I said, that might end up being 2 videos just because I've got a lot of opinions that I want to share about Judas Iscariot, and I don't want to rush through it. I've got a lot of stuff that I want to talk about just to wrap this series up, and I think Judas Iscariot is the way to do it. I might end up making a video that's recapping all the stuff after that. I haven't decided that yet. But I have a lot to say about Judas Iscariot, and so that might just be a really long one video, or maybe I'll split it into two. I haven't decided yet. But I'm excited to talk about that. I'm a little bit scared to talk about it because the way that I view Judas is a very scary figure. And if anything, like, he's just somebody that really does terrify me a little bit because there's so much about him that, like, I see myself in him. And he's probably one of the most tragic and one of the scariest figures in all of Scripture. And so I do want to give us time to wrestle through that. And I want us to understand that character really, really well. And so, We'll be going through him next week, and maybe the week after that. I'm not totally sure. Who knows? With the amount that I ramble, might end up spending like 5 weeks on it. There is a time, just to give you a heads up, there was a time where I was considering writing a book about Judas Iscariot, and I've written multiple songs about him in my album Awako Sleeper. I've got a lot of opinions about Judas, and so I'm excited to talk about him. But yeah, that'll be starting next week, and then after that, we'll be concluding the series, and then we'll be moving into the prophets, and I'm very excited to start moving into those as well. And eventually I'd like to do other videos on, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, other first century styled stuff. But I'm not sure. I'll figure out when I'm going to do that. Pretty flexible with all that stuff. But thank you so much for watching this. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell. If anything, comment below and just say hello, because that in and of itself will let YouTube know that these are channels, that this is a channel worth watching, that these are videos worth watching, and it'll recommend it to other people. And so any interaction that you give to this, other than a thumbs down, please don't do that, but any interaction you give to this video will encourage YouTube to share this with more people, and that's a way to get this channel to grow. Also, if you comment below, I really enjoy talking with y'all, and I enjoy getting to know you, and I like hearing y'all's stories. Sometimes I'll have live streams where I just get to talk with y'all and get to know you, because I really do want to develop a sense of community with this group. It's not going to be a family like a lot of people suggest, because I don't think we'll ever be as close as that, because I'm not going to be naive there. But I do want to get to know y'all. If y'all are going to sit down and y'all are going to watch me for hours, I think the least I could do is try to get to know some of y'all. And so please be sure to just introduce yourself. Even if it isn't related to the content of the video, I would love to get to know you. I'd love to just know who you are, where you're from, how long you've been walking with God, if you're walking with God. That stuff's really cool to me, and I love interacting with people like that, and I would like to develop a sense of community amongst this group. And so be sure to comment and just say hi, and I'd love to respond to you and get to know you. But that being said, that's the end of this video. I've talked long enough. Thank you so much for watching it. I will see y'all next week as we start talking about Judas Iscariot. Woo, I'm nervous. But until then, be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. My name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. I will see y'all later. Bye.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.